Hey everybody! In today's video, I'm going to show you a glazing technique to make a colored image look vintage like this one. This is a very simple process. It just means you're covering up a colored image with a brown glaze to resemble vintage botanical or bird type illustrations. I've always loved vintage illustration imagery. And one of the things that I notice when looking at them and trying to figure out what I like about them is that they have an overall like warm sepia tone to them. The focal point is always usually really bright. That would be the brightest and the darkest. And the background imagery, especially when the subject matter is a bird, usually just completely fades into the background. So flowers or anything that might be in the background fade away and the whole thing is washed in this warm color. So I thought I would try to recreate that today. I'm starting with just adding some overall color to the background. You're not really going to see this color in the end. There'll be a little bit of the blue that peeks through, but what I'm trying to do is cover up the white cardstock because that's going to mean that that background is a lot darker, and that's what I want. But you will see a little bit of the blue in the end. Now the main image is a single stamp, and I have it masked here for the blending part. I'm using sea glass and sweet corn inks and just filling in the areas around the floral stamp that I stamped on top of the bird. This is a large floral and it takes up most of the background, and I thought it would be perfect for that sort of vintage card look. So I masked the bird after stamping it in fade out ink, and then I stamped the flowers on top of it. That's also a single image. It's very large. And then I put some color into the background. So when I remove the mask, I can see it was off just a little bit. So there's a little white space around the bird's tail, but that's really no big deal because I can go finish that with the alcohol markers that I'll be using to color this image. Now don't worry when I start coloring because it's going to be very bright. That's because I know I'm toning the whole thing down with brown, as you saw in the photo in the beginning. So I want those images underneath to have a lot of kind of vibrancy to push through that brown and put your focus really on the bird image. So I chose kind of an unusual color scheme for the bird. I chose greens. I'm going in with some very bold greens. And what you'll see as I speed this up and color it is that there's a very big difference in tonal value between the bird and the leaves and the flowers in the background. And that is to preserve the bird as the focal point when I end up glazing it. So I'm just very roughly covering this area with flicks of marker. I'm going to put a little bit of red on the bird as well. And then just very simple, quick marker flicking. This didn't take long to color at all with this technique. The other thing about a glaze is when you put it on top of an alcohol colored image, it sort of smooths out a lot of the details. So your details don't need to be perfectly blended. You can have some of this feather texture and some of the texture that I'm going to end up putting into the flowers. And when you wash it with that brown glaze, that will all sort of fade back just a little bit. Now, if you do want to leave a little bit of white space somewhere around your image, that will just be filled with that sepia color, but it will be a brighter spot in the image. So I'm using two colors of green only, just a lighter green and a darker green from my graphite markers. And what I'm doing now is I'm going back with the super fine point on the graphite markers. This marker is my favorite, as you know, because I do like the ability to put those teeny tiny lines back in, as well as the larger lines that I added with the brush end of the marker. So now that he's done, I'm going to go put back in the eye detail. I'm going to do the eye and the beak in black. So I have just a set of multi-liners with various thicknesses. And I usually go in with the thinnest one first, and then I come back with a thicker one to fill in. So like I outlined that little highlight on his eye with the thinner marker, and then I filled the rest of it in with the thicker marker. So I'm going for very, very pale colors for the flowers because I want those to fade into the background and I don't want them to stand out as much as the bird. They're really just pattern more than they are color. So I have a very pale blue and a pale violet that I will just be flicking the flowers with and leaving some white space so that those will be sort of brighter in the finished image. Now, before I put the glaze on, these colors are a little bit bright. So when you see the finished colored image at the end, you might be thinking, that looks a little bit crazy. But the brown evens it all out and turns it into kind of a sweet antique look that I really like. But these are very simple to color. These flower images are really big, which is another reason that I loved masking the bird and stamping these on top, because I knew that it would fill up most of the background and give me that detail that I want. Now, one thing that you can see in the background, it is fade out ink, so I know it's a little bit hard to see, but the leaves are even softer and less detailed than the flowers. So I'm omitting a lot of the detail in the floral stamp as it is. But on the leaves, I'm really going to omit all of the veining detail. You'll hardly even see the leaves in the finished card because the vintage illustrations that I like, they do fade at a certain point. So if there's a flower behind a bird, only part of the flower will be colored and the rest will sort of fade into the background. It's sort of the way that you would create a spotlight in photography, or when you have, an aperture of lens that lets the background be blurry and the foreground be sharp, like portrait mode on an iPhone. That is a similar technique. So I think that's what those artists were doing in those vintage illustrations by making those flowers and landscapes and things like that fade into the background. One great place to go look for vintage imagery is a website called the Graphics Fairy. She has all kinds of cool tools on her site. There's some things that you can pay for. There are a lot of things that are free downloads of vintage imagery that you can use however you want if you want to do image transfers, etc. But sometimes if I'm just looking for a look that I'm going for, like I know in my head I want a vintage bird illustration, but I need somewhere to get started, I'll go look through her archives because she has them all categorized. So you can look by birds, you can look by architecture, all these different subject matters she has grouped together, and you can find images, and she very clearly states on her images what the licensing is. So if it's a completely royalty-free image that you can download and use however, she'll tell you that. If it's a restricted image that you can only use in certain circumstances and not others, she'll tell you that. It's funny, it's a website that's evolved a lot over the years. I was using Graphics Fairy, oh my gosh, in the early 2000s when I was doing swaps on Split Coast. And if you wanted some vintage imagery, you could go to her site and use it for artist trading cards. And that's, I think, sort of how her website got its start. And back then, everything was free, but her site grew and grew and grew into this amazing resource. And so now she does offer some things to help her pay for the site. And it's just been fun to watch because it was one of the very first websites that I used frequently for art. So I definitely recommend a trip over there. Now I'm using the dim green Copic, like I said, to color leaves with absolutely no detail whatsoever. And most of these are just going to fade underneath the glaze, but you will see a little bit of leaf detail in the finished card. But it's very easy to color these and very quick with no details. Just very simple shapes in the background and barely darker than my background color. It is one shade, if that, darker in value than my ink blended background. So now I will finish the beak, which is the final detail. This is always pretty scary when you're going back and outlining a stamp image in black when not really anything else on the card is black, but you just have to be brave and follow the illustrator's lines to put that detail back in. In the vintage illustrations that I look at, a lot of the bird beaks were black. I think we always want to color them yellow or orange, but really most of them were black in the ones I looked at, and it gives such gravity and such a fun look. Now to finish with the glaze, all I did was mix glazing medium and 2 drops of Vintage Photo Distress Ink Reinker, and I just painted that on top of this whole image to turn it into a warm, vintage feeling card from this bright, colorful card. You can still see all the floral detail and the detail of the birds. Head over to my blog for more information, and thanks so much for watching.